Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 34, and the first mistake I made at Ocala National Forest was thinking the woods knew my footsteps. What happened there last October still wakes me up at night. Cold sweat pooling in the hollow of my throat as I remember the sound of my sister's voice calling from the trees, 3 days after we buried what was left of her. I should start at the beginning, back when Sarah was still Sarah, before the forest took her and sent something else back wearing her face. We'd planned the RV trip for months. Sarah had just finished her residency at Tampa General, and I'd finally gotten my landscaping business stable enough to take a week off. Our parents thought we were crazy. Two 30-somethings taking a sibling bonding trip in a rented Winnebago through Central Florida's backwoods. But Sarah had been different since medical school, distant in a way that worried me. Dark circles under her eyes, a nervous habit of checking her phone even when it hadn't buzzed. She needed this. We both did. The Ocala National Forest sprawled across 383,000 acres of scrubland, pine forests and swampland north of Orlando. Sarah had picked it specifically because it was one of the few places in Florida where you could truly disappear from civilization. Cell service was spotty at best, and some of the camping areas were accessible only by dirt roads that wound through miles of Spanish moss and palmetto thickets. We'd reserved a spot at Salt Springs Recreation Area, but Sarah convinced me to take a detour on our second day. She'd found references online to an old logging road that led to a primitive camping area called Whisper Pine Hollow, a place that didn't appear on any official park maps but showed up in scattered forum posts from hardcore survivalists and off-grid enthusiasts. "Come on, Marcus," she'd said, spreading a hand-drawn map across our tiny dinette table. "When's the next time we'll have a chance to camp somewhere completely untouched? No bathroom facilities, no other campers, just us and the real Florida wilderness." The Sarah I remembered from childhood had been cautious to a fault, the type of kid who'd make our parents sign permission slips before riding her bike to the corner store. But this new Sarah, this post-residency Sarah, seemed hungry for risk in a way that made my stomach twist. Still, I was her big brother. I'd been protecting her since she was 5 years old and broke her arm falling from the tire swing I'd hung too high. If she wanted to go off the beaten path, I'd make sure she stayed safe. The mistake was thinking I could. We left Salt Springs early Thursday morning, our 32-foot Winnebago groaning along increasingly narrow dirt roads that seemed to swallow our tire tracks behind us. The GPS had lost signal after the first mile, and Sarah navigated using her hand-drawn map and a compass our grandfather had given her. "Left at the dead cypress," she called out, checking her notes. "Then, straight for 2 miles until we see the old fence post with the metal tag." The forest pressed closer with each turn. Ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss formed a canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight. Palmetto fronds scraped against our windows with sounds like fingernails on glass, and more than once I had to get out and move fallen branches from our path. "You sure about this?" I asked after we'd been driving for nearly an hour. "This road looks like it hasn't been used in years." Sarah was bent over her map, pencil tucked behind her ear. The forum post said it was overgrown. That's what makes it special. It's like stepping back in time to what Florida was like before development. What she didn't mention was how the trees seemed to lean inward as we passed, or how the normal sounds of a forest, bird calls, insect buzzing, the rustle of small animals, had gradually faded to nothing. By the time we reached Whisper Pine Hollow, the only sound was our engine and the whisper of wind through Spanish moss. The camping area was a small clearing maybe 50 feet across, ringed by towering longleaf pines. A fire ring made of blackened stones sat in the center, and someone had built a rough picnic table from pine logs. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, something about the place made my skin crawl, like the feeling you get when someone's watching you from across a crowded room. "Perfect," Sarah breathed, already climbing out of the passenger seat. "Look at this place, Marcus. It's like our own private world." I forced a smile and started the process of setting up camp. The RV's generator hummed to life, and I ran the leveling jacks down until we were stable. Sarah busied herself collecting firewood, humming tunelessly as she worked. For the first time in months, she seemed genuinely happy. That should have been my second warning sign. We spent the afternoon exploring the immediate area. A faint trail led away from the clearing toward what Sarah's map indicated was an old sinkhole. Though the path was so overgrown, we turned back after 20 minutes. As the sun began to set, we returned to camp and got our first fire going. "Remember when Dad used to take us camping at Miyaka?" Sarah asked, poking at the flames with a stick. "You were so convinced there were alligators in every shadow." "There were alligators," I said. "That's why they put up all those warning signs. You made me sleep in the middle of the tent so they'd have to eat you first." She laughed, but it sounded forced, like she was trying too hard to recapture something that was already gone. We cooked hot dogs over the fire and opened a couple of beers. As full darkness settled over the forest, I became aware of how complete the silence was. No owls hooting, no insects chirping, no distant sound of traffic or aircraft. Just the pop and hiss of burning wood and our own voices. "It's quiet out here," I said. Sarah nodded, staring into the flames. Peaceful. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that makes you hold your breath, like the forest itself was listening. We turned in around 10, Sarah taking the bed over the cab while I converted the dinette into my sleeping area. The RV felt cramped and vulnerable surrounded by all those trees, but the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the soft glow of the LED strips were comforting. I was nearly asleep when I heard Sarah's voice. "Marcus, you awake?" "Yeah. What's up?" "Do you hear that?" I listened. Nothing but the gentle whisper of wind through pine needles. "Hear what?" "Like singing. Very soft." I strained my ears but caught nothing. Probably just the wind. These old pines make all kinds of sounds. Maybe. But she didn't sound convinced. I dozed fitfully, waking several times to check the locks on our door and windows. Each time, the forest seemed a little closer, the trees leaning in like curious giants. Once, around 2 a.m., I could have sworn I heard footsteps circling our RV, but when I peered through the window blinds, I saw nothing but darkness. Friday morning brought no relief. If anything, the oppressive quiet seemed worse in daylight. Sarah was already up when I emerged from my makeshift bed, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee. "Sleep okay?" I asked. "Not really." She turned to face me, and I was startled by how pale she looked. I kept hearing things. Voices maybe, like people talking very quietly just outside. "Probably other campers," I said, though I knew there were no other campers for miles. "Sound carries weird in the woods." She nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. We made breakfast, scrambled eggs and bacon on the RV's stovetop, and tried to recapture the previous day's sense of adventure. But something had changed overnight. The forest felt actively hostile now, like we were trespassing in a place that didn't want us there. "Let's check out that sinkhole trail," Sarah suggested. "The map shows it's only about a mile from here." I wasn't enthusiastic about leaving the relative safety of the RV, but Sarah seemed determined. We packed water bottles and a basic first aid kit, and I made sure to bring my father's old buck knife and a GPS unit, even though the latter hadn't shown a signal since we'd entered the forest. The trail was even more overgrown than I'd remembered from our brief exploration the day before. Palmetto fronds and saw grass crowded the path, and hanging Spanish moss created a tunnel-like effect that blocked most of the sunlight. We had to push through spider webs every few yards, and the air grew thick and humid as we moved deeper into the forest. "This is ridiculous," I said after we'd been walking for 20 minutes. "We should turn back." "Just a little further," Sarah insisted. She was about 10 feet ahead of me, moving with a confidence that seemed unnatural given how difficult the terrain was. "I can see it opening up ahead." She was right. The trail suddenly emerged into a circular clearing maybe 100 feet across. In the center was the sinkhole, a perfectly round depression about 30 feet in diameter, dropping away into darkness. The walls were limestone, carved smooth by centuries of water flow, and a few stunted trees clung to the edges. But what caught my attention wasn't the sinkhole itself. It was what surrounded it. Someone had arranged stones in concentric circles around the depression, each ring about 6 feet apart. The stones weren't natural. They were carved, covered in symbols that looked like they belonged in a museum, not a Florida forest. And between the stone circles, driven into the ground at regular intervals, were wooden stakes topped with small bundles of what looked like hair and feathers. Jesus, I breathed. What is this place? Sarah was already walking toward the sinkhole, seemingly oblivious to the obvious ritual setup. It's beautiful, she said. Look how deep it goes. I grabbed her arm before she could get too close to the edge. Sarah, we need to leave. Now. Why? It's just an old sinkhole. Look around you. I gestured at the stone circles, the stakes, the way the trees seemed to lean away from the clearing as if afraid to get too close. Someone's been using this place for something, and I don't want to find out what. For a moment, her face went blank, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then she blinked and seemed to see the ritual setup for the first time. Oh, God, she whispered. Marcus, what is this? I don't know, and I don't want to know. We're leaving. But as we turned to go, I realized I couldn't remember which direction we'd come from. The tree line looked identical in every direction, and the path we'd followed seemed to have vanished entirely. Which way? Sarah asked, and I could hear the first note of panic in her voice. I pulled out the compass, but the needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. My phone showed no signal, and the GPS unit displayed only a blank screen. Stay calm, I said, more to myself than to her. We'll walk in a straight line until we hit the trail, then follow it back. We picked what seemed like the most likely direction and started walking. But after 20 minutes of pushing through increasingly thick undergrowth, we hadn't found any trace of a trail. Worse, when I looked back, I couldn't see the sinkhole clearing anymore. It was as if the forest had swallowed it up behind us. Marcus, Sarah said quietly, I think we're lost. The next 4 hours were a nightmare of wrong turns and false trails. Every direction looked the same. Endless pine trees draped in Spanish moss, palmetto thickets that tore at our clothes, and a canopy so thick that we couldn't get a bearing on the sun. My phone remained dead, the compass useless, and the GPS showed only static. By late afternoon, we were exhausted, scratched up from pushing through thorns, and no closer to finding our way back to the RV. Sarah had grown increasingly quiet, responding to my attempts at conversation with single-word answers. When she did speak, it was to make observations that made my skin crawl. The trees are watching us, she said at one point. Sarah, no, look at them. Really look. See how they turned to follow us? I looked, and for a terrifying moment I could almost see what she meant. The moss-draped branches did seem to shift as we passed, like massive arms reaching out to grab us. It's just the wind, I said firmly. We need to focus on getting back to camp. But there was no wind. The forest was as still as a held breath. As darkness began to fall, I made the decision to stop and wait for morning. We found a small clearing where we could see some sky through the canopy, and I used my knife to cut palm fronds for a makeshift shelter. Sarah helped without complaint, but I could see something was wrong with her. Her movements were too fluid, too graceful for someone who'd been stumbling through undergrowth all day. And her eyes. Her eyes reflected light like an animal's. Sarah, I said carefully, how are you feeling? Fine, she said, but her voice sounded different. Flatter, like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. We huddled together under the palm fronds as full darkness settled over the forest. I'd hoped to hear some sound that might give us a direction. A highway, an aircraft, anything that would tell us which way civilization lay. Instead, the silence was absolute, broken only by our own breathing. Around midnight, Sarah began to hum. It was the same tuneless melody she'd been humming when we first arrived at Whisper Pine Hollow, but now it seemed to echo strangely in the darkness, as if the trees themselves were picking up the sound and passing it along. I was about to ask her to stop when I realized the humming was coming from the wrong direction. Sarah was lying next to me, breathing deeply in sleep, but the humming was coming from somewhere in the trees above us. I lay perfectly still, afraid to move, as the sound circled our makeshift shelter. It wasn't one voice, It was many, harmonizing in a way that made my teeth ache, and slowly, gradually, the humming began to resolve into words. Come home, come home, come back to us. I must have dozed because the next thing I knew, Sarah was shaking me awake. Pale dawn light filtered through the canopy and birds were actually singing. The first natural sounds I'd heard since we'd entered the forest. Marcus, wake up. I found the trail. I sat up, blinking away the memory of voices in the darkness. What trail? The one back to the RV. I got up early to look around and I found it about 50 yards that way. She pointed through the trees. We must have walked right past it yesterday. Relief flooded through me as we packed up our meager camp and followed Sarah through the forest. Sure enough, after a few minutes of walking, we emerged onto what was unmistakably a trail. Not the overgrown path we'd taken to the sinkhole, but a clear, well-maintained trail that I was certain hadn't been there the day before. Thank God, I breathed. How did you find this? I heard voices, Sarah said casually. They led me right to it. The walk back to our campsite should have taken 30 minutes. Instead, it took nearly 3 hours because every time I thought we were getting close, the trail would fork or curve in an unexpected direction. Sarah seemed to know exactly where we were going, leading confidently even when the path split into multiple options. But something about her certainty made me nervous. How do you know which way to go? I asked after she'd chosen correctly at the 6th fork in the trail. The voices tell me, she said, and when she turned to smile at me, I saw that her pupils had contracted to pinpricks despite the dim forest light. When we finally reached Whisper Pine Hollow, I nearly wept with relief. Our RV sat exactly where we'd left it, generator humming, solar panels glinting in the filtered sunlight. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, except for the footprints. They circled our campsite in a perfect ring, maybe 20 feet from the RV. Bare footprints, human-sized but wrong somehow. The toes too long, the arch too high, and they were filled with what looked like black water that didn't evaporate even in the Florida heat. Sarah, I said quietly, do you see? But when I turned around, she was gone. I called her name, searched the immediate area, checked inside the RV. Nothing. It was as if she'd simply vanished the moment we'd returned to camp. The rational part of my mind insisted she'd just wandered off to relieve herself, or maybe to gather more firewood. But the footprints around our campsite told a different story. I was starting the engine when I heard her voice calling from the forest. Marcus, help me! The voice was coming from the direction of the sinkhole trail, maybe a quarter-mile away. I grabbed a flashlight and my knife and plunged into the trees, following the sound of her calls, but the voice seemed to move as I chased it. Always just ahead, always just out of sight. Marcus, over here! Sarah, where are you? Help me, something's wrong. I ran through the forest for what felt like hours, crashing through palmetto thickets, tearing my clothes on thorns, following a voice that led me in circles. By the time I realized I was being led away from the campsite, it was too late. I was lost again, alone in a forest that seemed actively malevolent. This time, I didn't try to find my way back. I picked a large pine tree and climbed as high as I dared, hoping to spot our RV or at least get a bearing on the sun's position. What I saw from 30 feet up made my blood freeze. The forest stretched in all directions, unbroken by roads or clearings. But scattered through the trees, maybe a mile away, I could see lights. Campfires, I thought at first, but the lights were moving, dancing between the trees in patterns that suggested intelligence. And they were all moving toward my location. I climbed down and ran. For the next 6 hours, I was hunted through the Ocala National Forest by things that stayed just beyond the edge of sight. I caught glimpses, pale figures that moved too quickly between the trees, shapes that flickered at the corner of my vision, shadows that fell in the wrong direction. And always I could hear Sarah's voice calling to me from the darkness. Marcus, where are you? I'm scared, Marcus. Help me. Why did you leave me? But it wasn't Sarah. Not anymore. The voice was too perfect, too controlled. Like something that had learned to mimic human speech but hadn't quite mastered the emotional undertones. By pure luck, I stumbled back onto a real trail just as the sun was setting. My clothes were shredded, my hands and face scratched bloody, and I was so dehydrated I could barely think straight. But the trail was marked with official Park Service signs, and after another hour of walking, I saw the blessed sight of electric lights through the trees. The Salt Springs Recreation Area was buzzing with activity. RVs, tents, families cooking dinner over camp stoves. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that something was very wrong in the deeper parts of the forest. I stumbled into the ranger station and tried to explain what had happened. Lost sister, GPS failure, strange noises in the night. The rangers were sympathetic but not particularly concerned. People got lost in Ocala all the time, they said. Most turned up within 24 hours, usually embarrassed but unharmed. They organized a search party for the next morning. We found our RV exactly where we'd left it in Whisper Pine Hollow. The generator had run out of fuel, and our food was starting to spoil, but everything else was intact. There was no sign of Sarah, no indication of a struggle. Just those strange footprints circling the campsite now dried to crusty black stains in the Florida sand. The search continued for 3 days. Helicopters, tracking dogs, volunteers from local hiking clubs. They found traces, a scrap of her shirt caught on a thorn bush, a footprint in the mud near the sinkhole. But they never found Sarah. On the 4th day, they found a body. It was in the sinkhole, floating face down in the black water at the bottom. The rangers said she must have fallen in during the night, probably disoriented after getting lost. Accidental death, case closed, but I knew better. I'd seen the body they pulled out of that hole, and whatever it wasn't my sister. Oh, it looked like her. Same height, same build, same strawberry blonde hair. But when they turned it over, the face was wrong. The features were too sharp, the skin too pale, and the eyes were solid black, like pools of the same dark water that had filled those footprints around our campsite. I tried to tell them. I called the sheriff's office, the state police, anyone who would listen. But what was I supposed to say? That my sister had been replaced by something that lived in the forest? That the body they'd found was some kind of changeling? They thought I was suffering from grief and trauma. Recommended counseling, prescribed anti-anxiety medication, suggested I take some time off work to process my loss. So I kept my mouth shut and played the role of the grieving brother. We held a funeral service in Tampa, where Sarah had been living. Closed casket, of course. They said the body had been too damaged by its time in the water. I stood there listening to her friends and colleagues talk about what a wonderful person she'd been, how she'd touched so many lives during her residency, how she'd had so much potential. And the whole time, I kept thinking about those voices in the forest, the ones that had led her to the trail that first morning, the ones that had called my name as I'd stumbled through the darkness, the ones that were calling to me even now, even here in the civilized world of concrete and electric lights and cell phone towers. Because here's the thing they don't tell you about losing someone to the forest. It doesn't end when you leave. Whatever took Sarah, whatever replaced her with that thing in the sinkhole, it followed me home. I hear her voice sometimes late at night when the air conditioning cuts off and the house goes quiet. She calls my name from the kitchen, or from the backyard, or from the bathroom down the hall. When I go to investigate, there's never anyone there. But sometimes I find wet footprints on the floor, and they always lead toward the sliding door that opens onto my back patio. Last week, I installed security cameras around my house. Motion activated, infrared capable, the works. The first night, they captured something standing at the edge of my backyard, just beyond the reach of the floodlights. It looked like Sarah. Same height, same posture, same way of holding her head slightly tilted when she was listening for something. But when the motion sensor triggered the floods, the figure didn't move like a human. It flowed backward into the darkness, dissolving into shadows like smoke. I've stopped sleeping, stopped going to work. My friends think I'm having a breakdown, and maybe I am. But I know what I saw in that forest, and I know what's been visiting my house. The thing that took my sister's place isn't done with me yet. Sometimes, when I'm sitting here in my living room at 3 in the morning, all the lights on, all the doors locked, I can hear humming from outside. That same tuneless melody Sarah used to hum, the one that echoed through the trees in Whisper Pine Hollow. And sometimes, if I listen carefully, I can make out words in the humming. Come home, come back to us. The worst part is, I'm starting to want to. I'm starting to remember that perfect silence in the forest, that sense of being watched by something vast and patient and ancient. The normal world feels thin now, like tissue paper stretched over something terrible and wonderful. I catch myself driving toward Ocala on weekends, taking the back roads that lead to those old logging trails, because I think I understand now what happened to Sarah. She didn't get lost in the forest. She got found. Whatever lives in those deep places, whatever made those stone circles around the sinkhole, it recognized something in her that I couldn't see. Some hunger, some longing for something beyond the ordinary world of medical residencies and career plans and family expectations. It gave her what she was looking for, and now it's offering the same thing to me. I'm writing this down because I need someone to know what really happened in Whisper Pine Hollow. If you're reading this, it probably means I finally stopped fighting the voices that call to me from the forest. Don't come looking for me. Don't trust anything you find that looks like me or sounds like me. And whatever you do, don't go to Ocala National Forest looking for answers, because the forest remembers everyone who walks beneath its trees, and some of them are still there, waiting in the shadows between the Spanish moss, humming lullabies for the living. They're very patient, these things that live in the deep places. They can wait decades for the right person to wander down the wrong trail. And when they find someone who's ready to let go of the world of electric lights and GPS signals and cell phone towers, they welcome them home with open arms, just like they welcome Sarah, just like they're going to welcome me. Story 2. They said the Icicle Creek campground in the Wenatchee National Forest is beautiful in late light. My name is Sarah, I'm 34, and I learned beauty can be a trap. Marcus had been planning this trip for months, ever since the divorce papers were finalized. We need to get away from everything, he'd said, his voice carrying that particular strain that meant he was holding himself together with determination and coffee. Just us, the RV, and some perspective. I'd agreed because Marcus was my brother, and because after watching him crumble through 18 months of legal proceedings, I thought maybe the Washington wilderness could give him back some piece of himself. What I didn't anticipate was how the forest would take pieces of us instead. We'd driven the rented 30-foot Winnebago up from Seattle, Marcus white-knuckling the steering wheel through every mountain curve while I navigated and tried to ignore how the trees seemed to press closer to the road with each mile. The campground sat in a valley between two ridges, surrounded by old-growth fir and pine that created a natural amphitheater of green so dense it swallowed sound. "This is perfect," Marcus had said when we pulled into Site 17, the words coming out too bright, too forced. "Look at that view." I looked. The site backed up against a creek that gurgled and whispered over smooth stones, and beyond that, the forest climbed steep slopes until it disappeared into shadows that seemed too dark for 3 in the afternoon. Perfect wasn't the word I'd have chosen. We spent the first hour setting up camp with the methodical precision of people trying to impose order on something that felt fundamentally wild. Marcus leveled the RV and connected the utilities while I arranged our gear and tried to shake the feeling that we were being cataloged by invisible eyes. The only other occupied site was clear across the campground, a distant pop of orange from another RV that might as well have been on another planet. "The ranger said we might see some wildlife," Marcus mentioned, checking his phone for the 3rd time and frowning at the no-service icon. "Bears, maybe deer." I'd met the ranger at check-in, a woman in her 50s with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in the mountains. She'd handed over our site information with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Beautiful spot," she'd said. "You folks planning to stay long?" When I'd told her just the weekend, she'd nodded like that was somehow the right answer. "Well, you stick to the marked trails if you do any hiking. Easy to get turned around in these woods." Then she'd paused, looking past me toward the RV. "GPS can get a little funny up here, too. The trees mess with the satellites." Now, as evening settled over the campground like a blanket being slowly pulled tight, I found myself thinking about that conversation. The GPS in the RV had been acting strange since we'd passed the Forest Service Road turnoff. The screen flickering between our location and empty gray space, the little arrow spinning in confused circles. "It's just the mountains," Marcus said when I mentioned it. He was building a fire in the metal ring, feeding kindling to flames that seemed reluctant to catch. Same reason the cell service is garbage. But I'd been watching the GPS during our drive, and the glitches hadn't started until we'd passed a particular bend in the road. The same bend where I'd noticed something odd. Tire tracks leading off into the trees where no road should be. Too fresh to be from Forest Service vehicles, too deep to be from anything small. The fire finally caught, casting dancing shadows across our campsite. Marcus settled into his folding chair with a beer and the kind of sigh that meant he was trying to leave his troubles in Seattle. For a while, we just sat in comfortable silence, listening to the creek and the soft sounds of the forest settling into night. That's when I first heard it. A sound like someone walking in circles just beyond the firelight, footsteps that never seemed to get closer or farther away. Just circling. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Marcus tilted his head, listening. "Hear what?" The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining my ears, but there was only the creak and the whisper of wind through pine boughs. Nothing. Must have been an animal. But I'd grown up camping with our parents, and I knew the difference between animal sounds and human sounds. What I'd heard had been deliberate, measured, the kind of walking someone does when they're pacing, thinking, planning. We stayed by the fire until nearly 11, when the temperature dropped enough to send us inside the RV. Marcus took the master bed in the back while I made up the dinette conversion in the main living area. The RV felt solid and safe with its locked door and drawn curtains, a pocket of civilization in the wilderness. I was almost asleep when the walking started again. This time it was closer, and there was no mistaking the sound. Footsteps in a slow, steady circle around our RV. Not the shambling gait of a bear or the quick scurry of smaller wildlife. Human footsteps, deliberate and patient. I lay still, barely breathing, counting the steps. 15 paces along the driver's side. A pause at the front. 15 paces along the passenger side. A pause at the back. Then the pattern repeated. From the back bedroom came Marcus's soft snoring, completely undisturbed. The walking continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the windows for any hint of movement, but the forest kept its secrets. Morning brought coffee and rational explanations. "Probably just a curious deer," Marcus said when I told him about the nighttime visitor. "They're not afraid of campsites." I wanted to believe him. In daylight, with bacon sizzling in the pan and my brother humming while he broke eggs, it was easy to dismiss my midnight fears. The forest looked benign in the morning light, all dappled sunbeams and bird songs. We decided to take a short hike after breakfast, following a trail that paralleled the creek into the deeper woods. The ranger had mentioned it as an easy walk to a small waterfall, perfect for photos and a peaceful lunch. The trail was well marked, with the kind of sturdy wooden signs that spoke of regular maintenance. But as we walked deeper into the forest, I began to notice something odd about the trees. Many of them bore scars, not the random damage of storms or wildlife, but deliberate cuts in the bark forming symbols I didn't recognize. "Look at this," I called Marcus over to a particularly large pine. Someone had carved what looked like a circle with lines radiating outward, the cuts deep and relatively fresh. Marcus frowned, running his fingers over the carving. Probably just kids, or some wannabe mystic marking their territory. But the symbol appeared again and again as we hiked, always carved into trees that flanked the trail, always at eye level. They weren't random teenage vandalism. They were markers, guides, signs for someone who knew how to read them. The trail wound higher into the mountains, following the creek's meandering path through stands of old-growth timber. We'd been walking for about an hour when Marcus suddenly stopped. "Where's the trail?" he said. I looked around, realizing with a chill that the worn path we'd been following had simply ended. We stood in a small clearing surrounded by unmarked trees, with no visible trail in any direction. "It has to be here somewhere," I said, but even as I spoke I was pulling out my phone to check our location. No signal, and the GPS app showed only gray static. Marcus was doing a slow turn, studying the tree line. We couldn't have gotten off the trail. We were right on it. We spent 20 minutes searching the edge of the clearing, looking for any sign of the path we'd arrived on. But the forest seemed to have erased our route, leaving us in a pocket of wilderness that felt increasingly isolated with each passing moment. "There," Marcus said finally, pointing to a gap between two large firs. "That has to be the way back." I couldn't see any trail, but the gap did lead roughly in the direction we'd come from. We pushed through the undergrowth, branches catching at our clothes and skin, following what might have been an animal track through the trees. After 30 minutes of difficult hiking, we emerged back at our campsite. "That's impossible," I said, staring at our RV. "We walked uphill the whole time. There's no way that path led back here." Marcus was checking his watch, his face pale. "Sarah, what time did we start hiking? Maybe 10:30? Why? It's 3:15. I looked at my own watch, certain he was wrong. But the numbers didn't lie. Somehow, our hour-long hike had taken nearly 5 hours, and neither of us could account for the missing time. We spent the rest of the afternoon at the campsite, neither of us wanting to venture back into the woods. Marcus busied himself with maintenance tasks on the RV while I tried to read, but the words kept blurring together as my mind replayed our impossible hike. The symbols on the trees, the vanishing trail, the lost time. They were connected somehow, part of a pattern I couldn't quite grasp. As evening approached, I found myself dreading nightfall. The forest seemed different now, less benign, as if our morning excursion had awakened something that had been sleeping. The trees pressed closer to our campsite, their shadows reaching toward our fire ring like grasping fingers. "Maybe we should pack up tomorrow," I suggested as Marcus started building another fire. "Head back to Seattle a day early." He paused, a piece of kindling in his hand. "Because we got a little lost on a hike?" "It wasn't just getting lost, Marcus. Something's not right here." But he was already shaking his head. "I need this, Sarah. I need to prove to myself that I can handle a weekend in the woods without falling apart. If I go running back to the city every time something feels weird, how am I supposed to face anything else?" I understood. The divorce had left him questioning everything about himself, and this trip was supposed to be about rebuilding confidence. But, as I watched the fire catch and throw its dancing light across the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were exactly where something wanted us to be. The footsteps started again at midnight. This time, Marcus heard them too. I felt him go rigid in the bed at the back of the RV as the measured pacing began. Step, step, step around the driver's side. Pause. Step, step, step around the front. Pause. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. The footsteps stopped. We lay in the darkness, listening to silence so complete it felt solid. Then, barely audible, came a new sound. Scratching, like fingernails on metal, coming from somewhere near the door. Marcus slipped out of bed and crept toward the front of the RV. I followed, my heart hammering against my ribs. He peered through the front window, then quickly drew back. "There's someone out there," he breathed. "What do you mean, someone?" "Standing by the fire ring. Just standing." I looked through the window myself and saw nothing but darkness and the faint glow of embers from our evening fire. "I don't see anyone." Marcus looked again, and I watched his face go white. "They're gone," but the scratching continued, moving along the side of the RV now, deliberate and persistent. It sounded like someone trying to find a way in, testing the windows and door for weaknesses. "Should we call for help?" I whispered. Marcus held up his phone. Still no signal. The scratching moved to the back of the RV, directly below the bedroom window. Then it stopped, leaving us in that oppressive silence. We waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. When morning came, we found the scratches. Long, deep gouges in the RV's aluminum siding, running from the wheel wells to the roof. They weren't random damage. They formed patterns, the same radiating symbols we'd seen carved into the trees. Someone, or something, had spent hours methodically marking our temporary home. "We're leaving," I said, and this time Marcus didn't argue. But the RV wouldn't start. Marcus turned the key and the engine turned over normally, caught, then immediately died. He tried again with the same result. The dashboard lit up with error messages about the fuel system, though the tank was 3/4 full. "It was running fine yesterday," Marcus said, popping the hood and staring at the engine like it might explain itself. I was already walking toward the camp host station, hoping to find the ranger or at least a phone. But the small building was empty. A handwritten sign on the door reading, "Back Monday." It was Saturday. When I returned to our site, Marcus was sitting on the picnic table staring at his phone. "The GPS is working," he said, holding up the screen. But instead of showing our location at Icicle Creek Campground, the map displayed us as being in an unmarked area dozens of miles from any road. "That's impossible," I said. But even as I spoke, I was looking around our campsite with new eyes. The creek still gurgled nearby, the trees still towered overhead, but something was subtly wrong. The light fell differently, and the mountains visible through the canopy didn't quite match my memory of the previous day. Marcus was methodically checking every system in the RV, growing more frustrated with each failed attempt to start the engine. "There's nothing wrong with it," he said. "Every diagnostic shows green. It should start." I was studying the symbols scratched into our RV's siding when I noticed something that made my blood go cold. The marks weren't random after all. They formed a rough circle around the entire vehicle with lines radiating outward. It was the same symbol we'd seen on the trees, only larger, more elaborate. "Marcus," I said quietly, "I think we're in a circle." He looked up from the engine. "What do you mean?" I pointed to the scratches, then to the trees surrounding our campsite. Now that I was looking for it, I could see the pattern. Every tree within about 30 yards of our RV bore the carved symbol, creating a rough ring around our site. "We're not supposed to leave," I said. That's when we heard the voices. They came from the forest, carried on a wind that seemed to blow from all directions at once. Multiple voices, speaking in unison. Words I couldn't quite make out, but that raised the hair on my arms. The voices were calling something, or to something, in a rhythm that made my teeth ache. Marcus grabbed my hand. "Sarah, look." People were emerging from the tree line, dozens of them moving in perfect synchronization toward our campsite. Men, women, children, all dressed in hiking clothes, all with the same fixed smile, all walking in that measured pace I'd heard circling our RV. "Get inside," Marcus said, but I was already moving. We locked ourselves in the RV and drew all the curtains, but we could still hear them outside. The footsteps had multiplied into a complex rhythm, dozens of people walking in patterns around our trapped vehicle. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and I finally understood what they were chanting. "Come out! Come out! Come out!" Through a gap in the curtains, I caught glimpses of them. They moved like dancers in a rehearsed performance, weaving between the trees, always maintaining their formation. But their eyes were wrong, too wide, too bright, like people in the grip of religious ecstasy. "What do they want?" Marcus whispered. The chanting stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard a new sound, scratching on the RV's roof. Something was up there, moving around directly overhead. A voice spoke from above us, clear and conversational. "We've been waiting for you." It was the ranger's voice, the woman who'd checked us in, but there was something wrong with it. The words were hers, but the tone was off, like someone reading from a script without understanding the meaning. "Waiting for what?" Marcus called out. To complete the circle, more scratching on the roof, and I realized with horror that they were carving symbols into the metal. We could hear them cutting through the aluminum, methodical and patient. "The circle needs to be closed," the ranger's voice continued. "You're the final piece." Through the windows, I could see that the people had arranged themselves in a perfect ring around our RV, all facing inward, all with that same unnatural smile. Children stood next to adults, families grouped together, but their unity felt wrong, less like community and more like a hive mind. "Sarah," Marcus whispered. "Look at their feet." I looked down and felt my sanity slip another notch. None of them were touching the ground. They hovered inches above the forest floor, swaying slightly in a wind I couldn't feel. The scratching on the roof intensified, and I could smell something burning. Not wood or metal, but something organic and wrong. The air in the RV grew thick and hard to breathe. "We have to run," I said. Marcus nodded, his face gray with terror. He crept to the driver's seat and turned the key. This time, the engine caught and held. "Now," he said. I threw open the door and we ran, leaving everything behind except our terror. The circle of floating people turned to track our movement, their smiles never wavering, but they made no move to follow. They just watched as we sprinted toward the camp road, their eyes reflecting the moonlight like animals. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, collapsing beside the Forest Service road where it met the highway. Marcus's phone had 1 bar of signal, enough to call 911. The sheriff's deputy who responded was kind but skeptical. He drove us back to the campground at first light, but Site 17 was empty. No RV, no people, no sign that we'd ever been there. The scratched symbols on the trees were gone. The site looked pristine and untouched. "Sometimes the mountains play tricks on people," the deputy said gently. "Altitude, isolation, stress, it can make you see things." We filed a report about the stolen RV and drove back to Seattle in a rental car. The insurance company was sympathetic but firm. There was no record of our RV ever being at Icicle Creek Campground. The campground itself, according to their investigation, had been closed for renovations all season. Marcus sold his house 3 months later and moved to Phoenix. He says the desert feels safer, more honest. We don't talk about that weekend, but sometimes I catch him staring at maps of the Southwest, tracing routes that carefully avoid anything green. I still live in Seattle, but I've never gone camping again. Sometimes, late at night when the rain is drumming on my windows, I hear them. Footsteps in a measured circle around my apartment building. When I look outside, there's never anyone there. But the next morning, I sometimes find symbols scratched into the concrete near the building's entrance. They're waiting for me to come back and complete the circle. I know this with the same certainty I know my own name. The ranger was right. We were the final piece of something that had been building for a long time in those mountains. Something that needed to be closed to become whole. I've researched Icicle Creek Campground extensively. According to official records, it's existed for 30 years and has an excellent safety record. But when I dig deeper into local newspaper archives, I find strange stories. Families who vanish for days and return with no memory of where they've been. Hikers who speak of getting lost and finding themselves in camps that shouldn't exist. People who describe symbols carved into trees and voices in the forest calling them home. The stories always end the same way. The missing people are found, unharmed but changed. They move away from the mountains, but they never really escape. And sometimes years later they're reported missing again. Their cars found parked at trailheads with no sign of their owners. I keep my curtains drawn now and avoid looking at maps of Washington State. But I dream about the forest, about that circle of smiling people floating above the ground, and I wake up knowing that someday I'll go back. Not because I want to, but because some choices aren't really choices at all. The circle needs to be closed, and I'm still the final piece. Story 3. I'm Marcus, 34. I came to Hoosier National Forest to stop dreaming about the past, but the past was already waiting between the pines. The RV's engine coughed as I pulled into the primitive campground off Forest Road 108, deep in the Indiana wilderness. 3 days of solid driving from Phoenix had left my hands cramped around the wheel and my mind still circling the same bitter thoughts. Sarah's laugh. The way she'd packed her books first, then her clothes, like she was already mentally gone before her body followed. The empty space in our bed that had grown wider each night until I couldn't stand sleeping in it anymore. So I'd bought this used Winnebago, loaded it with enough supplies for a month, and pointed it toward the thickest patch of green I could find on the map. Hoosier National Forest promised 200,000 acres of nothing but trees, wildlife, and blessed silence. No cell towers. No neighbors. No memories of a woman who'd decided I wasn't enough. The campground was smaller than I'd expected. Just 6 numbered sites carved out of the forest, each one isolated by thick stands of oak and maple. Only one other site was occupied, a newer Airstream parked at Site 3, its silver skin gleaming in the late afternoon sun. I pulled into Site 5, as far from the other camper as possible. As I leveled the RV and hooked up my water, I caught glimpses of my neighbor through the trees, a woman, maybe 40, with graying brown hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was setting up a camp chair outside her trailer, moving with the efficient motions of someone who'd done this many times before. When she noticed me watching, she raised a hand in greeting. "First time at Charles Deem?" she called out, referring to the wilderness area that bordered the campground. "Yeah," I called back, not wanting to encourage conversation, but not wanting to be rude either. "You?" "Oh, I've been coming here for years. It's peaceful. Good for thinking." She smiled, but something in her expression seemed forced. "I'm Diana, by the way. Marcus." I turned back to my setup, hoping she'd take the hint, but she didn't. "You picked a good week for it. Weather's supposed to be perfect. Though," she paused, and when I looked back, she was staring off into the woods with a troubled expression. "Though they've been having some strange reports lately." "Strange how?" "Oh, probably nothing. Hikers getting turned around, finding things that aren't supposed to be there. You know how it is in the deep woods. Your mind plays tricks." She laughed, but it sounded hollow. "The rangers put out a bulletin about an old ranger station that some folks have been stumbling across. Thing is, it's not on any maps, and the Forest Service says they never built anything in that area." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm evening air. "What kind of things are people finding there?" Diana shrugged, but her eyes remained fixed on the tree line. "Equipment mostly. Old uniforms, logbooks, radio gear. All of it decades old. But—" She trailed off. "But what?" "But the logbooks have entries from last week." She finally looked at me, and I could see genuine unease in her face. "Look, I'm probably just spooked by campfire stories. But if you're planning any serious hiking, maybe stick to the marked trails, okay?" I nodded, though part of me was already intrigued despite myself. After 20 years as a systems analyst, I'd learned to be skeptical of things that didn't add up. A ranger station that shouldn't exist, with fresh entries in old logbooks? It sounded like someone's idea of a prank. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, meaning it. Diana smiled again, this time more genuinely. "Well, I'll let you get settled. If you need anything, just holler." As darkness crept between the trees, I cooked a simple dinner on my camp stove and tried to enjoy the silence I'd driven so far to find. But the quiet felt different here. Not peaceful, but expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. I'd brought a stack of books thinking I'd finally have time to read without distractions. But when I opened the first one, a thriller about a man whose wife disappears, Sarah's face stared up at me from every page. I closed it and reached for my phone instead, forgetting there was no signal this deep in the woods. Around 10 o'clock, I heard Diana's generator shut off and her lights went dark. The only sounds now were the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant call of an owl. I should have felt relaxed, but instead I found myself straining to hear something else. Footsteps, voices, anything that might explain the weight of unease settling over the campground. I was just drifting off when I heard it. The crackle of a radio. Faint but unmistakable. Static and voices, too distant to make out words but close enough to be real. I sat up in bed, listening. The sound seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, maybe half a mile away. After a few minutes, it faded into silence. The next morning, I mentioned it to Diana while we both made coffee. "Radio chatter?" She frowned, stirring instant coffee with a plastic spoon. "That's odd. The rangers use different frequencies, and they don't usually patrol this area at night." She paused. "You sure it wasn't a CB radio? Sometimes truckers on the highway can bleed through." "Highway's 20 miles from here," I pointed out. "True." She looked troubled again. "Maybe I'll ask at the ranger station when I head into town later. Speaking of which, you need anything? I'm making a supply run." I almost said no, then remembered I'd forgotten to buy batteries for my flashlight. Actually, yeah, D batteries if you can find them. No problem. She hesitated. Marcus, about that radio thing, maybe don't go looking for it, okay? This place has a way of getting under your skin if you let it. After she left, I spent the morning exploring the immediate area around my campsite. The forest was beautiful in a way that made you understand why people wrote poems about trees. Massive oaks towered overhead, their canopy so thick it filtered the sunlight into cathedral beams. Wildflowers carpeted the forest floor in splashes of purple and yellow. Birds called from the branches, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the musical babble of a creek. But there was something else too, a sense that I was being watched. Not by animals, which would have felt natural, but by something patient and intelligent. Several times I spun around, certain I'd glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision, only to find empty woods. By afternoon, restlessness had overtaken my attempts at relaxation. I'd come here to escape my thoughts, but the enforced solitude was having the opposite effect. Every quiet moment filled itself with memories of Sarah, of the fights that had grown more frequent in our final months together, of the morning I'd woken up to find her wedding ring on the kitchen counter and a note that began with, "I'm sorry, but I needed to move, to do something with my hands and mind." Diana had warned me about wandering off the marked trails, but I wasn't planning anything ambitious, just a short hike to stretch my legs and maybe find that creek I'd been hearing. I grabbed my day pack, water bottle, and compass and headed into the woods behind my campsite. There was no trail here, but the forest floor was relatively clear, carpeted with decades of fallen leaves that muffled my footsteps. I picked a bearing northeast, toward where I thought the creek might be, and started walking. The woods felt different once I was away from the campground. Older somehow, like I'd stepped back in time to when these trees were saplings and the only human sounds were the calls of long-dead hunters. The modern world, highways, cell towers, the constant hum of civilization, seemed like a fever dream from another life. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I found the trail. It wasn't marked on my map, wasn't even supposed to exist according to the ranger station's information packet. But there it was, a narrow dirt path winding between the trees, worn smooth by countless feet. Old blazes scarred the bark of nearby oaks, faded orange paint that looked like it had been there for decades. Common sense told me to turn around. Diana's warnings echoed in my mind, along with the strange story about a ranger station that shouldn't exist. But I was curious now, and curiosity had always been my weakness. Besides, this was clearly an old trail, probably left over from the area's logging days. What harm could there be in following it for a little while? The path led northeast, roughly in the direction I'd been heading anyway. I checked my compass and noted the time, 2:30 p.m. I'd give myself an hour, then turn back regardless of what I found. The trail was well maintained despite its age, cleared of fallen branches and debris. Whoever had blazed it originally had chosen their route well, following the natural contours of the land and avoiding the worst of the underbrush. It was the kind of trail that invited you to keep walking, to see what lay around the next bend. As I walked, I began to notice other signs of human presence. A few hundred yards down the trail, I found a wooden trail marker, weathered but still readable. Ranger Station, 2.3 miles. Below that, in smaller letters, radio check, mile 1.5. My pulse quickened. This had to be the trail Diana had mentioned, the one that supposedly led to a station that didn't exist. But the marker looked genuine, old but not fake, carved from the same type of weathered oak used in official Forest Service signs. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, then remembered it was useless out here. No signal, and the battery was down to 20% anyway. I made a mental note to ask Diana about the marker when she returned. The trail began to descend into a narrow valley, following what looked like an old creek bed. The trees grew thicker here, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sky. It was cooler in the shadows, and I caught whiffs of something strange on the breeze. Not unpleasant exactly, but unfamiliar. Like ozone before a thunderstorm, mixed with something organic and earthy. At the 1.5-mile marker, another official-looking sign, I found the radio check station. It was just a small wooden platform built around the base of a massive oak tree, with metal brackets where a radio antenna might once have been mounted. But what made my skin crawl was the condition of the platform. It should have been rotted through after decades of weather, but the wood looked almost new. Fresh even, like it had been built yesterday. I climbed onto the platform and examined the brackets more closely. They were bolted to the tree with modern galvanized bolts, still shiny despite the forest's humidity. At the base of the platform, I found a small plaque. Radio Check Station, Estier 1987. Maintained by Hoosier National Forest Ranger District, 1987. That was less than 40 years ago, well within living memory. So why didn't this station appear on any modern maps? Why had Diana spoken of it like it was some kind of ghost story? I checked my watch. 3:15. I'd already been walking for 45 minutes, which meant I should start heading back soon. But the radio station was only another 0.8 miles according to the marker, and I'd come this far. Besides, I was making good time on the well-maintained trail. The decision made itself. The final stretch of trail climbed steadily upward, winding around massive boulders and through stands of pine that grew so thick they blocked out the afternoon sun. My breathing grew labored, and I had to stop several times to rest. This was harder hiking than I'd expected, and I was beginning to realize how out of shape I'd become during the long months of Sarah's departure. As I climbed, the smell I'd noticed earlier grew stronger. Not unpleasant, but definitely not natural. Like the air in a laboratory, sterile and charged with electricity. My compass began to behave strangely, too, the needle swinging wildly instead of pointing steadily north. I tapped the case, wondering if I'd damaged it somehow, but the erratic behavior continued. At 4:20, just as I was beginning to think I'd missed the station somehow, the trail crested a low ridge and dropped into a small clearing. The ranger station sat in the center of the clearing like it had grown there. It was larger than I'd expected, a single-story log building with a wraparound porch and a tall radio antenna rising from one corner. Solar panels glinted on the roof, and I could see the steady red blink of LED lights through the windows. A wooden sign by the front steps read, Hoosier National Forest, Ranger Station 7, Radio Communication Hub. Everything about it looked perfectly normal and completely impossible. The building was clearly old. The logs had that weathered gray patina that came from decades of exposure. But like the radio platform, it was in pristine condition. The windows were clean, the porch free of debris, the antenna guy wires taut and properly tensioned. Somewhere inside, I could hear the steady hum of electrical equipment. I approached the front steps slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was wrong, that buildings didn't just maintain themselves in the middle of the wilderness, that radio equipment didn't run without power lines or regular maintenance. But there it was, solid and real and utterly impossible. The front door was painted forest green, with a small brass nameplate that read, Station Commander, J. Harrison. Below that, a handwritten note in faded ink. Back in 30 minutes, radio check at 1700 hours. I checked my watch, 4:25 p.m. If the note was current, I'd missed the station commander by just a few minutes. The windows flanking the door were too dirty to see through clearly, but I could make out shapes inside. Desks, filing cabinets, the bulk of radio equipment. And something else, the steady glow of computer screens. I walked around to the side of the building, looking for another window or some clue to explain what I was seeing. Behind the station, I found a small generator shed and what looked like a water well with a modern electric pump. Both were in the same impossible state of preservation as the main building. It was then that I noticed the logbook. It sat on a wooden podium near the front steps, open to the current page and protected from the weather by a simple plexiglass cover. At the top of the page, someone had written, Daily Radio Check Log, October 2024. My hands shook as I lifted the cover and read the entries. October 1st, 1700 hours. All stations reporting normal. Weather clear. J. Harrison, October 2nd, 1700 hours. Static interference on Channel 7. Investigating. J. Harrison. October 3rd, 1700 hours. Interference resolved. New campers at Site 5. J. Harrison. The blood drained from my face. October 3rd was today, and Site 5 was where I was camped. Someone had been watching me. I flipped back through the pages, finding entries dating back months, then years. The handwriting varied. Sometimes the careful block letters of J. Harrison. Sometimes the flowing script of M. Rodriguez. Occasionally the cramped scrawl of T. Kim. All of them recent. All of them impossible. According to the entries, the station conducted daily radio checks with Ranger headquarters, monitored weather conditions, and kept track of camper activities throughout the forest. They noted wildlife sightings, trail conditions, and unusual incidents with the methodical precision of a functioning ranger station. But this station didn't exist. I was still staring at the logbook when I heard the radio crackle to life inside the building. Station 7. This is base. Radio check. Over. The voice was clear and professional. Exactly what you'd expect from a ranger dispatcher. I pressed my face to the nearest window trying to see inside, but the angle was wrong and the glass too dirty. A moment later, a different voice responded from inside the station. Base. This is Station 7. All clear here. One visitor currently on site. Over. My blood turned to ice water. They knew I was here. Copy that, Station 7. Visitor cleared for site inspection? Negative, base. Visitor appears to be civilian camper. Recommend standard protocol. Roger. Maintain observation and file report. Base out. The radio fell silent. I backed away from the building on unsteady legs, my mind reeling. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get back to my RV and drive until I hit pavement. But I forced myself to think rationally. Radio transmissions could be faked. Hell, maybe this whole thing was some kind of elaborate prank. Urban explorers or YouTube content creators setting up a fake ranger station to mess with hikers. But if it was a prank, it was the most elaborate one I'd ever seen. The building alone would have cost tens of thousands of dollars to construct and furnish. And the logbook entries went back years. Who would commit that much time and money to a joke that maybe a dozen people per year would ever see? I was still trying to make sense of it when I heard footsteps on the porch behind me. "Can I help you?" I spun around to find a man in a ranger uniform standing at the top of the steps. He was tall and lean, maybe 50 years old with graying hair and the kind of deep tan that came from spending most of your life outdoors. His name tag read J. Harrison, and everything about him looked completely normal except for his eyes, which seemed to look through me rather than at me. I was just hiking, I stammered. Found the trail and thought I'd check out the station. Harrison smiled, but it didn't reach those strange eyes. "Well, you found us. Not many people do anymore. Trail's not on the newer maps, you know." "Yeah, I noticed that." "Why not?" "Budget cuts," he said smoothly. "Station's still operational, but we're not officially part of the public trail system anymore. More of a research facility now." "Research into what?" The smile faltered slightly. "Oh, this and that. Wildlife patterns, weather monitoring, that sort of thing." He stepped down from the porch, moving with a strange, fluid grace that made my skin crawl. "You're the fellow camping at Site 5, aren't you?" "Marcus." I hadn't told him my name. More importantly, I was certain I hadn't given my name to anyone who might have relayed it to this station that supposedly didn't exist. "How did you—" "Small forest," Harrison said, his smile returning. "We like to keep track of who's visiting. Make sure everyone stays safe. These woods can be dangerous for people who don't know them well." There was something in his tone. Not quite a threat, but close enough to make my pulse spike. I should probably head back. It's getting late. "Yes, you should." Harrison's eyes never left mine. "Trail can be tricky in the dark, especially for someone not familiar with it. Easy to get turned around, end up somewhere you're not supposed to be." I nodded and started backing toward the tree line, every nerve ending screaming at me to get away from this man and his impossible station. But Harrison's voice stopped me. "Marcus." I turned reluctantly. "Stick to the marked trails from now on, okay? For your own safety." This time, the threat was unmistakable. I ran. Not immediately. I managed to walk calmly into the trees before my nerve broke, but once I was out of sight of the station, I ran like my life depended on it. Branches whipped at my face, roots caught my feet, but I didn't slow down until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I was completely lost. The trail was nowhere to be seen. I was standing in thick forest with no landmarks I recognized, no sign of the path I'd followed to reach the station. My compass still spun wildly, useless. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, and deep shadows were pooling between the trees. I fought down the panic rising in my throat and tried to think rationally. I'd been running roughly downhill, which meant the station was somewhere uphill behind me. If I could find the trail again, I could follow it back to the main trail system and from there to the campground. But 20 minutes of searching revealed nothing but more trees. The station had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. As darkness fell, I heard the radio chatter again. It was faint at first, just a whisper of static through the trees. But as I stumbled through the forest, trying to find anything that looked familiar, the voices grew clearer. Base, this is Station 7. Subject has left the immediate area. Copy, Station 7. Current location? Unknown. Subject appears to be disoriented. Recommend immediate retrieval protocol. Negative. Let him find his own way back. If he makes it to the campground, maintain surveillance. If not... The transmission cut off, leaving only static and the sound of my own ragged breathing. They were hunting me. I don't know how long I wandered through those woods. Time seemed to stretch and compress like taffy, minutes feeling like hours while hours passed in what felt like seconds. Twice I thought I saw lights through the trees, flashlights or lanterns moving in the distance, but when I tried to approach them, they vanished. The temperature dropped as the night deepened and I began to shiver in my light jacket. My water bottle was nearly empty and I had no food except for a granola bar in my pocket. If I didn't find my way back to the campground soon, I'd be spending the night in the forest with whatever else was out here. It was past midnight when I saw the glow. At first, I thought it was another false light, the kind that had been leading me in circles for hours. But this one was different, steady and warm, like campfire light filtered through canvas. I crept toward it carefully, afraid to hope. Diana's Airstream sat in the middle of a small clearing, exactly as she'd left it that morning. But something was wrong. The RV was glowing from within, not with electric light but with the warm, orange flicker of flames. And there was no sound, no generator, no radio, no movement at all. I approached the trailer slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The windows were too bright to see through, the glow too intense for any normal light source. As I got closer, I could smell something burning. Not wood or propane, but something organic and wrong. The door was standing open. I climbed the steps on unsteady legs and peered inside. The interior had been gutted by fire, but the flames cast no heat. The walls were blackened and warped, the furniture reduced to twisted metal skeletons, but the fire itself was cold as winter air. And in the center of the destruction, sitting in a camp chair that should have been ashes, was Diana. She looked up at me with eyes like burning coals and smiled. "Hello, Marcus. We've been waiting for you." I ran again, crashing through the forest in blind panic. Behind me, I could hear laughter. Not Diana's laugh, but something else wearing her voice like an ill-fitting mask. The sound followed me through the trees, echoing off the darkness until I couldn't tell where it was coming from. When I finally collapsed, gasping and shaking, I found myself back at my own campsite. The Winnebago sat exactly where I'd left it, showing no signs of the supernatural wrongness that had consumed Diana's trailer. My camp chair was still positioned beside the cold fire ring, my water jug still sat on the picnic table, my awning was still extended exactly as I'd left it. I wanted to believe I'd imagined everything. The impossible ranger station, the radio voices, Diana's burned-out trailer. Shock and exhaustion could explain a lot. Maybe I'd gotten lost. Maybe I'd hallucinated from dehydration. Maybe the whole thing was some kind of stress-induced breakdown triggered by Sarah's departure. But when I checked my phone, The timestamp on my last photo showed I'd been gone for less than 2 hours. 2 hours. I'd hiked for what felt like 6 miles, spent time at the ranger station, gotten lost in the woods for what seemed like half the night, and found Diana's trailer transformed into something out of a nightmare. All in less than 2 hours. I locked the RV's door and checked every window before allowing myself to collapse onto the dinette. My hands were still shaking as I poured myself 3 fingers of whiskey from the bottle I'd brought for emergencies. This definitely qualified. The alcohol helped calm my nerves enough to think clearly. Whatever I'd experienced, whether real or imaginary, I needed to get out of here. In the morning, I'd pack up and drive back to civilization. I'd find a motel somewhere, maybe see a doctor about possible hallucinations, definitely find a therapist to help me process whatever psychological break I'd just experienced. But first, I needed sleep. I pulled down the RV's shades and converted the dinette into a bed, then lay down fully clothed with my boots still on. If something came for me in the night, I wanted to be ready to run. I was just drifting off when I heard the radio. This time, it was coming from inside the RV. I sat bolt upright, listening. The sound was faint but unmistakable. The crackle of static followed by a voice speaking too quietly to understand. It seemed to be coming from the dashboard area where my CB radio was mounted. But I'd never turned the CB on. I'd forgotten it was even there. I crept toward the front of the RV, following the sound. The radio's face was dark, showing no signs of power, but the speakers were definitely producing sound. As I got closer, the voice became clearer. Base, this is Station 7. Subject has returned to campsite, requesting permission to initiate direct contact. Permission granted, Station 7. Use standard integration protocol. Copy that, Base, Station 7, out. The radio fell silent. I grabbed the CB's microphone with trembling hands and keyed it. Hello? Who is this? What do you want? Nothing but static. I tried again. This is Marcus at Site 5. I don't know what kind of game this is, but I'm calling the police in the morning. This time, a different voice answered. Calm, professional, and utterly inhuman. There is no need for alarm, Marcus. We simply wish to talk. About what? About your future. About the choices you'll need to make. About what happens to people who find things they're not supposed to see. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. I won't tell anyone about the station. I just want to leave. Oh, Marcus. The voice carried a note of gentle amusement. You can't leave. Not anymore. The forest has claimed you now, just like it claimed Diana. Just like it claims everyone who wanders too far from the marked trails. That's impossible. Diana has been missing for 3 weeks, the voice interrupted. Her family filed a report with the county sheriff. Her trailer was found abandoned at Site 3, with no sign of where she went. The room spun around me. No, that's not right. I talked to her yesterday. She went to town for supplies. You talked to something wearing her face, yes. Something that's been practicing her voice, her mannerisms, her memories. The forest is very good at preservation, Marcus. It keeps things that interest it. I tried to speak, but no words came. The choice is simple, the voice continued. You can fight us, in which case you'll simply disappear like all the others. Or you can accept what's happening and become part of something larger than yourself. The forest needs caretakers, you see. People to maintain the stations, monitor the trails, ensure that those who stray too far don't make it back to spread inconvenient stories. You're insane. Am I? Tell me, Marcus, what brought you here? A failed marriage? A desire to escape your own life? The forest knew you were coming long before you did. It called to you through your pain, guided you to exactly where you needed to be. The truth of those words hit me like a physical blow. I had chosen this place almost at random, picking it from a dozen similar locations based on nothing more than a vague sense that it was right. But now that I thought about it, the choice hadn't felt random at all. It had felt inevitable. The station you found is one of 7 scattered throughout these woods. The voice continued. Each one staffed by people who made the same choice you're about to make. People who understand that some things are more important than the life they left behind. What happened to the real rangers? The ones who actually worked here? They became something better. Harrison has been with us for 40 years now. Rodriguez joined us in the 90s. Kim is our newest recruit. She found Station 4 just last spring while hiking alone after her divorce. Kim, divorced, just like me. You see the pattern, don't you, Marcus? The forest doesn't choose randomly. It finds people who are already lost, already broken, already searching for something to give their lives meaning. All we do is offer that meaning. I thought about my empty apartment back in Phoenix, the job that felt more meaningless every day, the friends who'd chosen sides after the divorce and mostly chosen Sarah. What exactly was I fighting to get back to? I need time to think. Of course you do, but don't take too long, Marcus. The forest is patient, but not infinitely so, and the longer you resist, the more unpleasant the integration process becomes. The radio fell silent, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing certainty that I was going insane. I spent the rest of the night pacing the narrow confines of the RV, jumping at every sound from outside. Wind in the trees sounded like footsteps. An owl's call became a human scream. The settling of the forest around me felt like a living thing adjusting its grip. As dawn broke through the windows, I made my decision. I was getting out of here. Supernatural forest or no supernatural forest. Whatever was happening to me, psychological break, elaborate prank, or genuine paranormal encounter, I'd be better equipped to deal with it from civilization. I'd pack up, drive to the nearest town, and call for help. But when I stepped outside to retract my awning, Diana was sitting at my picnic table. She looked exactly as she had 2 days ago. Graying hair and a ponytail, comfortable hiking clothes, friendly smile. No sign of the burned-out shell I'd seen in the forest. No hint of the inhuman thing that had worn her face in that impossible nightmare. "Morning, Marcus," she said cheerfully. "Sleep well?" I backed toward the RV's door, my hand fumbling for the handle. "You're not real." "Of course I'm real." She stood up slowly, hands visible and empty. "I'm as real as you are. More real than you'll be soon, if you keep fighting this. The radio said you've been missing for 3 weeks." Diana's smile faltered slightly. "The radio says a lot of things, Marcus. Most of them true. Some of them aspirational. Time works differently here. I've been missing for 3 weeks, and I've been here for 2 days, and I've been here forever. All of those things are true. That doesn't make sense. Nothing about this makes sense from where you're standing. But step across the line, accept what we're offering, and it all becomes crystal clear." She gestured toward the forest, and for a moment I could swear I saw lights moving between the trees. Not flashlights this time, but something warmer and more welcoming, like windows glowing with lamplight, promising warmth and community and purpose. "What line?" "The one you're standing on right now." Diana's voice grew soft, almost hypnotic. "The choice between who you were and who you could become, between the broken life you left behind and the meaningful work we're offering." I thought about Sarah again, about the note she'd left, about the way she'd looked at me in those final months like I was already a ghost. Then I thought about my job, debugging other people's code in a cubicle farm where no one knew my name. I thought about my empty apartment, my non-existent social life, the growing certainty that I'd peaked at 30 and had nothing left to look forward to but decline. "What kind of work?" I heard myself ask. Diana's smile returned, brighter than before. "Preservation, protection, ensuring that the forest remains exactly as it needs to be. Some people are meant to find the stations, Marcus. People like you, like me, like Harrison and Rodriguez and Kim. People who understand that there are things more important than the mundane world outside these trees. And the people who aren't meant to find them?" Her smile didn't waver. "They don't." The simple statement carried more weight than any threat could have. I understood now why there were no warnings posted about the unmarked trails, no official acknowledgement of the ranger stations scattered through these woods. The forest itself was the warning, selecting carefully who would see what needed to be seen. "I need more time." "I know you do. But Marcus." Diana stepped closer and I caught that strange ozone smell again, fainter now but still present. Don't wander too far while you're thinking. The woods can be dangerous for people who don't know where they belong. She turned and walked into the forest, disappearing between the trees as if she'd never been there at all. I spent the next hour trying to convince myself to pack up and leave. I loaded some clothes into my duffel bag, emptied the gray water tank, retracted the awning. But every time I reached for the ignition key, something stopped me. Maybe it was the growing certainty that I'd never make it to the main road. Maybe it was the understanding that even if I did escape, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what I'd walked away from. Or maybe it was something simpler. The recognition that Diana was right about my life back in Phoenix. What exactly was I fighting to preserve? Around noon, I heard engines approaching through the forest. Not the smooth hum of modern vehicles, but the deeper rumble of older machinery. I stepped outside to see 3 Forest Service trucks pulling into the campground. The kind of heavy-duty pickups rangers used for backcountry work. All of them at least 30 years old, but maintained in pristine condition. Harrison climbed out of the lead truck, still wearing the same uniform I'd seen him in the day before. 2 other rangers followed. A Hispanic woman who must have been Rodriguez, and a younger Asian woman I assumed was Kim. All 3 moved with that same fluid grace I'd noticed in Harrison, like they were walking underwater. "Afternoon, Marcus," Harrison called out as they approached. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I stayed near my RV's door, ready to bolt inside if necessary. "What do you want?" "Just checking in," Rodriguez said, her voice carrying a slight accent. "Making sure you're settling in okay. These woods can be overwhelming for newcomers." Kim said nothing, just watched me with dark eyes that seemed to catalog every micro-expression on my face. "I was actually thinking about leaving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Harrison nodded sympathetically. "Course you were. It's natural to feel conflicted at first. But tell me something, Marcus. Where would you go? Back to Phoenix? Back to debugging code for people who don't know your name? Back to an empty apartment where you eat microwave dinners and watch Netflix until you fall asleep on the couch?" The accuracy of his description hit me like a slap. I'd never told anyone about my evening routine, certainly not anyone in this forest that supposedly didn't exist. "How do you—" "We know because we've all been there." Kim spoke for the first time, her voice soft but carrying absolute conviction. "The moment when you realize your life has become a series of habits you don't remember choosing. The growing certainty that you're already dead, you just haven't stopped breathing yet." "I divorced my husband 3 years ago," Rodriguez added. "Thought I wanted freedom. Thought I wanted to find myself. Spent 2 years hiking alone, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with all that freedom. Then I found Station 4, and suddenly everything made sense. Station 2 for me," Kim continued. "I was a software engineer in Seattle. Good job, nice apartment, everything I thought I wanted. But I'd wake up every morning feeling like I was suffocating. The forest saved me from that." Harrison stepped closer, his strange eyes fixed on mine. "The question isn't whether you want to leave, Marcus. The question is whether you want to live. Really live, with purpose and meaning, and the knowledge that your existence matters. Or whether you want to go back to sleepwalking through the remaining decades until your body finally catches up with what your soul already knows." I wanted to argue, to tell them they were wrong about my life, but the words wouldn't come, because they weren't wrong, not about any of it. What would I have to do? I heard myself ask. "Learn," Harrison said simply. "The forest has its own rhythms, its own needs. We'll teach you to read the signs, to understand what it requires. Some days you'll monitor the radio nets, keeping track of who's moving through the area. Some days you'll maintain the stations, ensuring everything stays in proper working order. And some days—" He paused, glancing at his companions. "Some days you'll help the forest decide who belongs and who doesn't." The chill that ran down my spine had nothing to do with the October air. What happens to the people who don't belong? "They get lost," Kim said matter-of-factly. "Happens all the time in these woods. Hikers take the wrong trail, lose their way, never make it back to their cars. Tragic, really. But the forest knows what it's doing." "You're talking about murder. We're talking about natural selection," Rodriguez corrected. "The forest has been here for millions of years, Marcus. Humans are the newcomers. Some of us learn to work with it, to become part of something larger than ourselves. Others, she shrugged, others provide different services. Harrison checked his watch, an old analog model that looked like it had been issued by the Forest Service decades ago. We need to get back to our stations. Radio check in 2 hours. But Marcus? He fixed me with that unsettling stare again. Think carefully about what we've offered. This opportunity won't come again. They climbed back into their trucks and drove into the forest, following paths that I was certain hadn't existed moments before. I watched until the sound of their engines faded into the distance, then sat heavily in my camp chair. My hands were shaking again. I tried to tell myself this was all an elaborate hoax, that I was the victim of some twisted psychological experiment or underground reality show. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. Who would go to such lengths? Who had the resources to build fake ranger stations and recruit multiple actors to mess with one random camper? And if it was real, if I really had stumbled into some kind of supernatural preserve where missing hikers became forest guardians, what did that mean for me? I thought about Sarah's face the last time I'd seen her, the mixture of pity and relief in her eyes as she'd explained why she was leaving. "You're not really living, Marcus," she'd said. "You're just going through the motions, waiting for something to happen. I can't wait with you anymore." Maybe she'd been right. Maybe I had been waiting, sleepwalking through my life until something came along to wake me up. The question was whether this was that something, or whether it was just another form of death. The afternoon passed in a haze of circular thinking. Part of me wanted to believe that everything I'd experienced was the product of stress and isolation, that a good night's sleep and some distance from these woods would restore my sanity. But another part, a part that was growing stronger by the hour, whispered that I'd found exactly what I'd been looking for: purpose, meaning, a place where I mattered. At 3:00 p.m., I heard the radio chatter begin again. This time, I didn't fight it. I walked to the CB and listened as the stations checked in one by one, reporting clear skies and normal conditions. When Harrison's voice came through the speaker, "Station 7, all clear," I found myself reaching for the microphone. "This is Marcus at Site 5, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'd like to speak with someone about your offer." The radio was quiet for a long moment. Then Harrison's voice returned, warmer than before. "Copy that, Marcus. Someone will be along shortly." Diana emerged from the trees 20 minutes later, but this time she wasn't alone. A young man followed her, maybe 25, with the kind of outdoorsy good looks that belonged in eerie eye catalogs. He moved with the same fluid grace as the others, but there was something different about him. Something nervous and excited, like a kid on Christmas morning. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet David," Diana said as they approached. "He's our newest recruit. Found Station 6 just last month." David grinned and extended his hand. "Great to meet you, man. Diana's told me a lot about you." I shook his hand, noting that his skin felt slightly too warm, like he was running a low fever. "How long have you been here?" "Feels like forever and no time at all," David replied, which wasn't really an answer. "Best decision I ever made, though. I was working dead-end retail in Indianapolis, living with 3 roommates, couldn't afford to go back to school. Now look at me. I'm part of something important." What exactly is this something? Diana and David exchanged a look that might have been meaningful or might have been nothing at all. "Why don't we show you?" Diana suggested. "There's a meeting tonight at Station 1, the main hub. All the station commanders will be there, plus some of the newer recruits. You can ask all the questions you want. And if I decide this isn't for me, then you're free to leave," Diana said, but something in her tone suggested that freedom might be more complicated than it sounded. David laughed. "Trust me, you won't want to leave. Once you see what we're really doing here, once you understand how the forest actually works, you'll wonder why you ever wanted to live any other way." They left me with directions to Station 1. Follow the trail behind Site 3 for 2 miles, turn left at the lightning-struck oak, continue until you smell wood smoke, and a time, 8:01 p.m. sharp. Diana mentioned that I should bring a change of clothes and anything else I might need for an overnight stay. Just in case the meeting runs late, she explained. But again, there was that undertone suggesting the overnight stay might not be optional. As evening approached, I found myself packing a small bag almost automatically. Change of clothes, toiletries, my wallet and phone, though the phone was useless here, a bottle of water. The motions felt familiar, like I'd done this many times before. At 7:30, I locked up the RV and started walking. The trail behind Site 3 was better maintained than the one I'd followed to Station 7, with proper blazes and regular distance markers, but there was something unsettling about it too. It felt too purposeful, too designed, like someone had planned exactly where every step should fall. The lightning-struck oak was impossible to miss. A massive tree split down the middle by some ancient storm, its hollow trunk large enough to walk through. Strange symbols had been carved into the bark around the opening. Not graffiti or trail markers, but something older and more deliberate. They reminded me of petroglyphs I'd seen in Arizona, all curves and spirals that seemed to suggest meaning without quite revealing it. The left turn took me down a steep slope into a narrow valley I hadn't seen on any topographic map. The trees here were enormous, old-growth oaks and maples that must have been standing when the first European settlers arrived in Indiana. Their canopy was so thick it blocked out the stars, leaving only narrow corridors of sky visible between the branches. I smelled the wood smoke before I saw the lights. Station 1 sat in a natural amphitheater carved out of the hillside, surrounded by a ring of standing stones that looked far older than any human settlement in this part of the continent. The building itself was larger than Station 7, a 2-story log structure with multiple chimneys and warm light spilling from every window. Smaller cabins dotted the surrounding area, connected by well-worn paths and flickering lanterns. It looked like a village. People moved between the buildings, dozens of them, all wearing the same Forest Service uniforms I'd seen on Harrison and his team. Men and women of all ages, all carrying themselves with that distinctive, fluid grace that marked them as different from ordinary humans. As I descended into the amphitheater, I began to make out individual faces. Some looked familiar. I was certain I'd seen several of them in old newspaper photos of missing hikers, the kind of stories that made the back pages of local papers before being forgotten. Others were complete strangers, but all of them wore the same expression of serene contentment that I'd noticed in David. They'd found their purpose. Harrison met me at the edge of the village, his smile more genuine than I'd ever seen it. "Marcus, glad you could make it. Welcome to the heart of our operation." He led me through the settlement, pointing out various buildings and their functions. The main station housed radio equipment that could reach anywhere in North America, plus computers running programs I didn't recognize. The workshops produced everything from trail markers to specialized equipment I couldn't identify. The library contained maps, journals, and historical records dating back centuries. "How long has this been here?" I asked. "The stones are pre-Columbian," Harrison replied. "Native Americans knew this was a special place long before European settlers arrived. The first European structure was built in 1847, a trading post where the current main station stands. It's grown steadily since then. And the Forest Service knows about it?" Harrison's smile became enigmatic. "The Forest Service is us, Marcus. Has been for decades. Oh, there are still mundane rangers working the public areas, handling the tourists and day hikers, but the real decisions, the important work, that's all done here." We approached the main building, where people were gathering for the meeting. I recognized Diana and Rodriguez among the crowd, along with Kim and David. But there were at least 30 others, maybe more, all of them watching me with expressions of friendly curiosity. "The new recruit!" someone called out, and there was a ripple of laughter through the crowd. "Marcus," Harrison announced, "meet your new family." The word hit me like a physical blow. Family. When was the last time I'd belonged to something that felt like family? When was the last time I'd walked into a room and felt welcomed rather than tolerated? The meeting itself was unlike anything I'd expected. No robes or chanting, no sacrificial altars or occult symbols. Just a group of people sitting in comfortable chairs around a large fireplace, discussing the practical aspects of forest management like any other government agency. They talked about trail maintenance schedules, wildlife population surveys, weather monitoring protocols. They reviewed incident reports from the past month, hikers who'd gotten lost, campers who'd had equipment failures, tourists who'd wandered into areas they shouldn't have accessed. It all sounded perfectly normal until you listened closely to what they weren't saying. The hiker who'd gotten lost had actually been led deeper into the forest after asking too many questions about the unmarked trails. The camper, with equipment failure, had been filming everything on his phone until his gear mysteriously stopped working. The tourists who'd wandered into restricted areas had been guided there by voices that sounded like their missing companions. The forest is selective, Rodriguez explained when I asked about the pattern. It knows who belongs and who represents a threat to the equilibrium we've worked so hard to maintain. What happens to the threats? They become part of the forest, Kim said simply. Everything here serves a purpose, Marcus. Trees, animals, soil, water, and people. Some people serve by maintaining the stations, others by ensuring our secrecy is preserved. The conversation moved on to other topics, supply schedules, communication protocols, personnel assignments, but I found myself fixated on that casual mention of people becoming part of the forest. I thought about the missing hiker reports Diana had mentioned, about the newspaper stories I'd half remembered seeing over the years. How many people disappeared in national forests every year? Hundreds? Thousands? And how many of those disappearances were actually the work of places like this? Around 10:08 p.m., Harrison stood and called for attention. "Before we adjourn," he said, "we have a decision to make regarding our newest potential recruit." The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward me. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, being evaluated by criteria I didn't understand. "Marcus has seen too much to simply walk away," Harrison continued. "The question is whether he's ready to commit fully to our mission, or whether he needs more encouragement." "What kind of encouragement?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "The kind that removes other options," Diana said gently. "Sometimes people need help understanding that their old life is already over." Kim stood up and moved to a window, peering out into the darkness. "We could arrange an accident on the way back to his campsite. Make it look like he got lost, fell into a ravine. Happens all the time in these woods. Or, Rodriguez suggested, we could let him return to his RV, but ensure that mechanical problems prevent him from leaving. A few days of isolation usually clarifies people's thinking." I realized with growing horror that they were discussing my murder as casually as they might debate lunch options. And the worst part was the expression on their faces. Not malicious or cruel, but genuinely concerned for my well-being. They honestly believed they were helping me. "I'll stay," I said quickly. "I mean, I want to join. This is what I've been looking for." Harrison studied my face with those penetrating eyes. "Are you certain, Marcus? Once you commit, there's no going back. You'll be cutting all ties with your previous life. No contact with friends or family, no return to Phoenix, no connection to the world outside these woods." I thought about my empty apartment, my meaningless job, my non-existent social life. What ties was I actually cutting? What would I be giving up that I hadn't already lost? "I'm certain," I said, and meant it. The room erupted in applause, and suddenly I was surrounded by people offering congratulations and welcoming me to the family. Someone handed me a glass of something that tasted like honey and burned like whiskey. Someone else produced a Forest Service uniform in my size, complete with a name tag that read M. Chen. Not my real name, but close enough to feel personal. "Welcome home, Marcus," Diana said, pulling me into a hug that felt surprisingly warm and genuine. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. The orientation process took 3 days. They moved me from my RV to a small cabin near the main station, furnished with everything I'd need for my new life. The first day was spent on basic training, radio protocols, trail navigation, forest management techniques. The second day covered more specialized skills, how to identify people who might pose security risks, techniques for discouraging unwanted exploration, methods for ensuring that problematic individuals never made it back to their vehicles. The third day was my first field assignment. "Simple job," Harrison explained as we hiked through the pre-dawn darkness, family camping at the public campground on the north side. Father's been asking questions about the unmarked trails, showing people photographs he took of trailblazes that aren't supposed to exist. We need to redirect his curiosity. We reached a position overlooking the campground just as the sun was rising. Through binoculars, I could see a man in his 40s setting up a camp stove while his wife and 2 young children slept in a tent nearby. He looked like any other suburban dad on a family camping trip. Polo shirt, khaki shorts, expensive hiking boots that had never seen a real trail. "What's the plan?" I asked. "You're going to approach him," Harrison said. "Tell him you're a ranger conducting a safety check. Mention that there have been bear sightings in the area he's been exploring. Suggest he stick to the marked trails for his family's safety. And if he doesn't listen," Harrison's smile was cold as winter wind, "then we'll have to ensure his family's safety through other means." I walked into that campground knowing I was crossing a line I could never uncross. The man, his name was Bill Patterson according to his permit, was friendly and talkative, eager to share his excitement about the hidden trails he'd discovered. He showed me photos on his phone, trailblazes, old markers, even a distant shot of what might have been Station 3. "It's like there's a whole other trail system out there," he said enthusiastically. "My GPS shows nothing, but someone's definitely maintaining these paths. You guys doing some kind of pilot program?" I fed him the lines Harrison had coached me on. Bear sightings, safety concerns, the importance of staying on approved trails. Patterson listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He was too smart, too observant, too dangerous to the careful secrecy the forest required. When I reported back to Harrison, his expression was grim but unsurprised. "Some people just can't be discouraged," he said. "Pity. He seems like a good father." That night, Bill Patterson left his tent to investigate strange sounds in the woods. His family woke to find him missing, his footprints leading into the forest and simply stopping. The search and rescue operation lasted 4 days, with teams from 3 counties combing the area. They never found a trace of him. His wife and children packed up and left on the 5th day, devastated and confused, but alive. The forest had taken what it needed and left the rest. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself that Bill Patterson had made his own choice when he'd refused to heed the warnings. I told myself that some secrets were worth killing to protect. But when I closed my eyes, I saw his children's faces as they called for their daddy in the woods. The months that followed blurred together in a haze of routine punctuated by moments of horror. Radio checks every morning and evening. Trail maintenance on Tuesdays and Fridays. Equipment servicing on weekends. And once or twice a month, special assignments that ended with someone disappearing from the forest forever. A solo backpacker who'd found Station 5 and tried to photograph it. A group of college students who'd discovered the stone circle and thought it would make a great Instagram location. A journalist investigating the unusually high number of missing persons cases in Hoosier National Forest. All of them became part of the forest in the end. I learned to live with the guilt by focusing on the purpose Diana and the others kept emphasizing. We were protectors, guardians of something ancient and important. The forest had chosen us to preserve its secrets, to maintain the balance between the mundane world and the deeper mysteries that most people were never meant to understand. It helped that my new life was genuinely fulfilling in ways my old existence had never been. The work was meaningful. The community was supportive, and for the first time in years I felt like I was part of something larger than myself. The other station commanders became the family I'd never had, united by shared purpose and mutual dependence. Sarah became a distant memory, along with Phoenix and debugging code and microwaved dinners. That life felt like something I'd dreamed rather than lived, insubstantial and gray compared to the vivid reality of my forest existence. But late at night, alone in my cabin, I sometimes heard voices in the wind, children calling for their father, wives searching for missing husbands, mothers weeping for sons who'd never come home. The forest kept their voices along with everything else, preserving them in the spaces between the trees where time moved differently and the laws of the outside world held no power. 6 months after my recruitment, I was promoted to Assistant Commander of Station 7. A year later, I was given my own station to manage, Station 9, a new installation deep in the most remote section of the forest. It was an honor, Harrison explained, reserved for those who'd proven their absolute loyalty to the mission. My first solo assignment came 2 weeks later. A young woman, maybe 25, hiking alone through my sector. She'd been asking questions at the visitor center about historical sites in the forest, showing particular interest in Native American settlements and early European trading posts. Her permit said she was a graduate student in anthropology, working on her dissertation about frontier interactions with indigenous peoples. Her name was Jessica. I watched her through binoculars as she made camp in a small clearing about a mile from Station 9. She moved with the confidence of someone comfortable in the wilderness, setting up her tent and organizing her gear with practiced efficiency. She was pretty in an outdoorsy way. Short blonde hair, athletic build, the kind of easy smile that probably made her popular with her professors and fellow students. She reminded me of Sarah. That night, I lay awake in my bunk listening to her voice carry through the trees as she recorded notes into a digital recorder. She was excited about something she'd found, some correlation between historical records and physical evidence that supported her thesis about trade relationships between European settlers and local tribes. She was smart, enthusiastic, dedicated to her research. She was exactly the kind of person the forest couldn't allow to continue digging into its secrets. The next morning, I approached her camp wearing my ranger uniform and carrying a clipboard. She greeted me with that bright smile and offered coffee from her camp stove, chattering excitedly about her research and the amazing historical sites she'd been documenting. "I'm particularly interested in the trading post mentioned in the 1847 territorial surveys," she said, pulling out a folder of photocopied documents. "The records indicate it was somewhere in this area, but I haven't been able to locate any physical remains." My blood ran cold. She was looking for Station 1. Trading post? I kept my voice casual. "I'm not familiar with any historical sites in this sector." "Oh, it's definitely here somewhere. The survey notes are very specific about the landmarks. A natural amphitheater surrounded by standing stones, near a creek that runs north-south through a valley. I've got GPS coordinates extrapolated from the 19th century measurements." She showed me her map, and I saw with growing dread that her projected search area encompassed the entire village. If she continued following her research, she'd stumble onto the hidden community within days. "Miss," I glanced at her permit. "Miss Rodriguez, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this area is going to be closed for the next few weeks. We've had some confirmed bear sightings, including a sow with cubs. For your safety, I'm going to have to ask you to relocate to a different section of the forest." Jessica's face fell. "Oh no, I've got limited time here. I'm flying back to California on Sunday. Is there any way I could get a special permit? I'm not planning any dangerous activities, just documentation and photography. I'm sorry, but safety regulations are non-negotiable. I can recommend some excellent historical sites in the southern section. Actually," she interrupted, her smile returning, "I might have found something already. Yesterday evening I discovered a trail that's not on any of the current maps. The blazes look old, but the path is clearly maintained. It seems to head directly toward where I think the trading post should be." My heart started hammering against my ribs. She'd found the access trail to Station 1. "That's interesting," I managed. "Can you show me exactly where?" She led me to the trail entrance, hidden among a stand of pine trees about 50 yards from her campsite. The blazes were faded but visible, marking a path that wound deeper into the forest toward the hidden village. "I was planning to follow it this morning," Jessica said excitedly. "My GPS shows it heading directly toward the coordinates from the historical survey. I think this might be the original access route to the trading post." I had to stop her. If she reached Station 1, if she saw the village and the people who lived there, if she documented any of it, The forest would never allow such a security breach to go unanswered. "Miss Rodriguez," I said carefully, "I really can't allow you to explore that trail. The bear situation—" "Oh, come on." She laughed, and the sound was bright and infectious. "I've been hiking solo for 6 years. I know how to handle wildlife encounters. Besides, it's broad daylight and I'll have my bear spray. It's not just about bears. This is an unmarked trail in unfamiliar territory. If something happened to you out there, if you got lost or injured, it could be days before anyone found you." Jessica studied my face, and I saw suspicion beginning to creep into her expression. "You know, that's odd. I checked with the ranger station yesterday, and they said this whole area was perfectly safe. No bear warnings, no trail closures. Are you sure you have the most current information?" Shit. She'd talked to the public rangers, the ones who worked the tourist areas and knew nothing about our operations. Of course, they'd given her different information. "There must have been a communication error," I said quickly. "These bulletins just came through this morning. I'll need to radio in and update the other stations." But Jessica was already backing away, her earlier friendliness replaced by wariness. "You know what? I think I'll just head back to the main ranger station and clarify the situation. Get the bear warnings directly from them." "Wait." She was already walking toward her camp, moving with purpose. I followed, my mind racing through options. If she reached the main road, if she talked to the public rangers about our conversation, they'd start asking questions about unauthorized personnel in the backcountry. The whole careful deception that kept our operations secret could unravel. I couldn't let that happen. "Miss Rodriguez, please, let me explain." She spun around, and I saw fear in her eyes now. "Explain what? Why you're trying so hard to keep me away from a historical site that should be public access? Why your information doesn't match what the official rangers told me yesterday?" "It's complicated." "No, it's not." She was backing toward her tent, hands fumbling for something in her jacket pocket. "You're not a real ranger, are you? What are you doing out here?" I should have let her go. Should have radioed Harrison and let him handle the situation through official channels. Should have walked away and trusted that the forest would deal with the problem in its own way. Instead, I did what 6 months of training had conditioned me to do. I protected the secret. The rock was about the size of a softball, granite worn smooth by centuries of weather. It fit perfectly in my hand as I picked it up from beside the trail. Jessica saw me grab it and started to run, but she was looking over her shoulder and didn't see the exposed root that caught her foot. She went down hard, her head striking another rock with a sound like a wooden spoon hitting a watermelon. The forest went silent around us. I knelt beside her still form, checking for a pulse I knew I wouldn't find. Blood pooled beneath her blonde hair, dark against the fallen leaves. Her eyes stared sightlessly at the canopy overhead, no longer bright with curiosity and academic enthusiasm. Jessica Rodriguez, graduate student in anthropology. Someone's daughter, probably someone's girlfriend, definitely someone who would be missed. In 3 days, when she failed to return from her hiking trip, people would start looking for her. They'd find her campsite, her research materials, her carefully plotted GPS coordinates, but they wouldn't find her body. The forest was very good at disposing of inconvenient evidence. I radioed Station 1 and reported the incident in the coded language we used for such situations. "Package delivery complete," I said into the handset. "Cleanup required at grid reference 4 to 7 Alpha." Harrison's voice crackled back through the static. "Understood, Station 9. Cleanup crew en route. Well done. Well done." As if I'd just completed routine maintenance instead of murdering an innocent woman whose only crime was academic curiosity. The cleanup crew arrived 2 hours later, Rodriguez and Kim, along with 2 men I didn't recognize. They worked with practiced efficiency, wrapping Jessica's body in a tarp and loading it onto an ATV. One of them gathered her research materials and camping gear, while another swept the area for any evidence of struggle. "First time?" Rodriguez asked as they prepared to leave. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "It gets easier," she said, not unkindly. "You did what had to be done. The forest will remember your service." After they left, I sat alone in the clearing where Jessica had died, staring at the dark stain her blood had left on the granite. Somewhere in the distance I could hear voices, not human voices, but something older and stranger, speaking in languages that predated human speech. The forest was singing, welcoming its newest addition to the choir of voices that whispered through the trees at night. I tried to feel satisfaction, or at least the peace that came with duty fulfilled. Instead, I felt hollow, like something essential had been carved out of my chest with a dull knife. The enthusiastic graduate student who'd offered me coffee that morning had become just another missing persons case, another family destroyed by questions that could never be answered. That night, I dreamed about Sarah. Not the bitter, angry woman who'd left me in Phoenix, but the laughing girl I'd fallen in love with in college. She was standing in Jessica's campsite, wearing the same bright smile the graduate student had greeted me with. "You could have stopped this," she said in the dream. "You could have just walked away." "I couldn't," I replied. The forest doesn't make you kill people, Marcus. You choose to kill people. There's a difference." I woke with tears on my face and the taste of blood in my mouth. 2 years. 2 years since I'd walked into Hoosier National Forest looking for escape from a failed marriage and a meaningless life. 2 years since I'd discovered the stations and the people who maintained them, and the terrible purpose that gave their existence meaning. In that time, I'd directly participated in the disappearance of 11 people. Hikers who'd asked too many questions. Campers who'd photographed things they shouldn't have seen. Researchers who'd gotten too close to uncovering the truth about the ancient community hidden in the heart of the forest. All of them had families. All of them had people who loved them, who filed missing persons reports and organized search parties and spent sleepless nights wondering what had happened to their sons and daughters and spouses and friends. I'd become everything I'd once despised. A predator hiding behind authority. A killer who justified murder with noble-sounding rhetoric about preservation and protection. The forest had given me purpose, but that purpose was built on a foundation of bones. The worst part was that I was good at it. Harrison had commended my natural talent for operational security. Rodriguez praised my intuitive understanding of threat assessment. Even Diana, who'd been like a mother to me in those early months, spoke approvingly of my evolution from recruit to full operative. I'd found my calling, it seemed. I was a natural-born killer who just needed the right motivation to discover his true nature. The breaking point came on a gray October morning, exactly 3 years after my arrival at the forest. I was conducting routine surveillance of the public campgrounds when I spotted them. A family of 4 setting up camp at Site 12. Father, mother, teenage daughter, young son. They moved around their campsite with the easy familiarity of people who'd done this many times before, unpacking gear and setting up their tent with practiced efficiency. The father looked like Bill Patterson. Not exactly. This man was taller, with darker hair and a different build. But something about the way he carried himself, the methodical way he organized their supplies, the gentle patience he showed when his son struggled with the tent stakes, it all reminded me of the man whose disappearance I'd facilitated 3 years earlier. I watched through binoculars as the family settled in for their stay. The teenage daughter helped her mother start a campfire while the boy explored the immediate area around their site. Normal family activities, the kind of innocent camping trip that happened thousands of times every summer across the country. Then the father pulled out a folder of papers and began studying them intently. My blood ran cold as I recognized the documents. Maps, historical surveys, photocopied pages from academic journals. The same kind of research materials that had gotten Jessica Rodriguez killed. The man's name was Dr. Michael Rodriguez, Jessica's father. I learned this when I intercepted his permit application at the ranger station that evening. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, professor of anthropology at UC Berkeley, continuing his daughter's research into historical trading relationships in Hoosier National Forest. The application included a heartbreaking note about completing the work Jessica had started before her tragic disappearance 3 years earlier. He'd brought his family to the place where his daughter had died, and he had no idea I was the one who'd killed her. That night, I sat in my cabin, staring at the file folder containing everything the forest's surveillance network had gathered about the Rodriguez family. Michael's academic credentials, his wife Elena's work as a high school teacher, their daughter Sophia's acceptance to Stanford in the fall, their son Diego's fascination with wildlife photography. A normal family. Good people. The kind of people who volunteered at food banks and helped their neighbors and never hurt anyone. And because of my actions 3 years ago, they were about to be destroyed. Michael Rodriguez wasn't just continuing his daughter's research. He was specifically investigating her disappearance. The folder contained copies of missing persons reports, correspondence with local law enforcement, even a private investigator's preliminary findings about inconsistencies in the official search and rescue operations. He was getting close to the truth, which meant he and his family were already dead. The forest had made that decision the moment his permit was approved. All that remained was the execution, and Harrison had already assigned that task to me. Poetic justice, he'd called it during our morning radio check. The operative who handled the original problem gets to clean up the loose ends. I'd accepted the assignment without protest, the way I'd accepted every other mission over the past 3 years. But as I sat in the darkness of my cabin, listening to the wind whisper through the trees, I realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't murder a man who was looking for answers about his daughter's death. I couldn't kill a mother who still hoped her missing child might somehow be found alive. I couldn't orphan 2 teenagers whose only crime was having a father who loved his dead daughter enough to risk everything finding out what happened to her. I'd become a monster, but I wasn't ready to become that much of a monster. Not yet. The next morning, I approached their campsite wearing my ranger uniform and carrying the same clipboard I'd used to deceive Jessica 3 years earlier. But this time, instead of feeding the family lies about bear sightings and trail closures, I told them the truth. "Dr. Rodriguez," I said when Michael looked up from his research materials, "I need to speak with you privately. It's about your daughter." His face went pale, but he stood and followed me away from his family, out of earshot of his wife and children. "You know something about Jessica?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "I know everything about Jessica," I replied. "I know she was here 3 years ago researching the same historical sites you're investigating now. I know she found things she wasn't supposed to find. And I know why she never made it home." Michael's hands clenched into fists. "You bastard. You know what happened to her and you let us suffer for 3 years wondering—" "I didn't let you do anything," I interrupted. "I killed her." The words hung in the air between us like a physical thing. Michael staggered backward as if I'd hit him, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and devastation in the space of a few seconds. "You... what?" "I murdered your daughter," I said again, forcing myself to meet his eyes. She was asking too many questions, getting too close to things that needed to stay hidden. So I killed her and let the forest dispose of her body. Michael lunged at me then, his academic composure finally breaking. But I was younger and stronger, hardened by 3 years of survival in the wilderness, and I easily restrained him. "Listen to me," I hissed in his ear as he struggled. "Your family is in danger. The same people who ordered me to kill Jessica have marked all of you for elimination. You have maybe 6 hours before they come for you." "Why are you telling me this?" he gasped. "Because I'm tired of being a killer," I said, surprised by the truth of it. "Because your daughter didn't deserve to die, and your family doesn't deserve to die, and maybe it's time I chose a different path." I released him and stepped back. "Pack up your camp and get out of here. Drive to the nearest police station and tell them everything. About Jessica's research, about the unmarked trails, about the ranger stations that don't appear on any official maps. Don't stop driving until you're out of Indiana." Michael straightened his shirt, his eyes never leaving mine. "What about you?" "I'll buy you time," I said. "Delay the operation, maybe create enough confusion for you to escape. But Dr. Rodriguez?" I grabbed his arm. "Whatever you do, don't come back. Don't send anyone else to investigate. The forest has been killing people for over a century, and it's very good at covering its tracks. My daughter, your daughter is gone," I said as gently as I could. "But your son and your other daughter are still alive. Focus on keeping them that way." I watched from the tree line as the Rodriguez family broke camp with frantic efficiency. Elena kept asking questions that Michael answered in Spanish too rapid for me to follow, but the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. Sofia and Diego sensed their parents' fear and worked without their usual teenage complaints, stuffing gear into bags and loading their car with desperate speed. They were packed and driving toward the main road within an hour. I gave them a 30-minute head start, then radioed Station 1. "Base, this is Station 9. We have a problem." Harrison's voice crackled back immediately. "What's your status, Station 9? The Rodriguez family has fled the area. They suspect surveillance and are heading for law enforcement contact." A long pause. When Harrison's voice returned, it was cold as January wind. "How did they become aware of surveillance, Station 9? "Unknown. Possibly outside intelligence. The father has been corresponding with a private investigator." Another pause, longer this time. In the background, I could hear multiple voices conferring in urgent whispers. "Station 9. Return to Station 1 immediately for debriefing." "Copy that, Base. En route." I packed my essential gear: water, first aid kit, the small amount of cash I'd accumulated over 3 years, and the .38 revolver Harrison had issued for emergency situations. Then I set fire to my cabin. The flames caught quickly in the dry autumn air, consuming 3 years of carefully constructed lies along with the building that had housed them. By the time the smoke was visible from Station 1, I was already hiking toward the forest's eastern boundary, following game trails and creek beds that wouldn't show up on any surveillance equipment. I had maybe 6 hours before they organized a full manhunt. 6 hours to cover 20 miles of wilderness and reach the state highway that marked the edge of the forest's influence. I'd never make it on foot, but I had an advantage they might not expect. I knew where they kept their vehicles. The motor pool was located in a concealed valley about 3 miles north of Station 1, hidden beneath camouflage netting and accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through seemingly impenetrable thickets. The Forest Service trucks, ATVs, and maintenance equipment necessary for operations were stored there under minimal guard. After all, who would be stupid enough to steal vehicles from a secret military installation in the middle of nowhere? Someone who had nothing left to lose, apparently. The guard was a recruit I didn't recognize, maybe 6 months into his service based on the newness of his uniform. He was sitting in a folding chair reading a paperback novel when I emerged from the trees behind him. "Sorry about this," I said, and hit him with a tire iron. He went down without a sound. I zip-tied his hands and feet with supplies from the maintenance shed, then dragged him out of sight behind a stack of spare tires. He'd live, assuming someone found him before hypothermia set in. The keys were kept in a locked box inside the main shed, along with fuel cards and maintenance logs. I selected a newish pickup truck with a full tank and 4-wheel drive. Something fast enough to outrun pursuit, but common enough to blend in once I reached civilization. As I drove through the forest on roads that appeared on no public maps, I tried not to think about what I was leaving behind. The community that had welcomed me when I had nowhere else to go. The people who'd become my family when my real family had abandoned me. The sense of purpose that had given meaning to my otherwise empty existence. All of it built on murder and deception, but it had been real nonetheless. I'd traded one kind of emptiness for another, and now I was trading that for... what? A life spent looking over my shoulder, waiting for the forest's agents to track me down and silence me permanently. Years of guilt and nightmares and the knowledge that I'd participated in atrocities I could never undo. At least, I'd saved one family. Dr. Rodriguez and his wife and children would go home to California, and maybe someday they'd be able to grieve for Jessica without the torture of unanswered questions. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. The pickup's headlights illuminated the forest boundary marker at 3:47 a.m. Beyond it, Interstate 64 stretched east and west across the Indiana landscape, carrying late-night travelers toward Louisville and St. Louis and 1,000 other destinations where the forest's influence couldn't reach. I turned west, toward the anonymity of urban sprawl and the slim hope of disappearing into America's vast population of drifters and lost souls. Behind me, the forest receded into darkness, but I could feel its attention like a weight between my shoulder blades. I'd escaped its physical boundaries, but I would never truly be free of it. The voices that whispered through the trees at night would follow me wherever I went, reminding me of the things I'd done and the prices I'd paid for belonging somewhere. 3 hours later, I abandoned the stolen truck in a Walmart parking lot outside Evansville and bought a bus ticket to Memphis with cash. The clerk didn't ask questions. Night shift workers at Greyhound stations see all kinds of desperate people and learn not to pry. As the bus pulled away from the terminal, I caught my reflection in the tinted window and barely recognized the man staring back. 3 years in the forest had changed me in ways that went deeper than the weathered skin and lean muscle. Something fundamental had been broken inside me, some essential connection between action and consequence that normal people take for granted. I'd become capable of murder, and worse, I'd become good at it. The bus carried me south through the pre-dawn darkness, past sleeping towns and empty highways and the endless sprawl of American loneliness. Somewhere behind me, search teams were probably already fanning out through the forest, following my trail with the same methodical precision they'd used to hunt down Jessica Rodriguez and Bill Patterson and all the others. They might catch me eventually. The forest was patient and had resources I couldn't imagine. But, for now, I was free. Free to carry the weight of my crimes into whatever remained of my life. Free to live with the knowledge of what I'd become and what I'd lost in the process. The Rodriguez family would make it home safely. That had to be enough. It was the only victory I was likely to get. 5 years later, I read about the discovery in a newspaper at a truck stop outside Bakersfield. Mass grave discovered in Indiana forest, read the headline. Above a story about construction workers who'd uncovered human remains while building a new visitor center at Hoosier National Forest. Dozens of bodies, the article reported. Some of them decades old, others more recent. All of them showing signs of violent death. The FBI had taken over the investigation. Special agents were interviewing families of missing persons, reviewing old case files, trying to make sense of what looked like the largest serial killing site in Indiana history. There was no mention of ranger stations or secret communities or ancient agreements between federal agencies and things that lived in the deep woods. The official investigation would find evidence of human predators, but nothing supernatural. Nothing that couldn't be explained by ordinary evil and bureaucratic incompetence. The forest would survive. It always did. But maybe some families would finally get answers. Maybe some of the missing would finally be mourned properly, their bones laid to rest in marked graves instead of unmarked holes in the wilderness. It wasn't justice, but it was something. I folded the newspaper and walked back to my truck, another anonymous driver on another endless highway. The CB radio crackled with chatter from other travelers, weather reports, traffic conditions, the mundane communications of people living normal lives. None of them spoke my name or mentioned the forest or acknowledged the voices that still whispered in my dreams. I turned up the volume anyway, letting their ordinary conversations fill the cab and drown out the sound of wind through trees that existed only in memory now. It helped, sometimes. Not enough, but sometimes. The highway stretched ahead into the California desert, carrying me toward another nowhere place where a man with no past could disappear for a while longer. Behind me, somewhere in the darkness between what was and what could never be undone, the forest waited with infinite patience for my eventual return. Because that's what forests do. They wait, and they remember, and they never truly let you go.